All right, so this is the skin, which is also known as the integumentary system. And obviously it's the largest membrane that we have on our body, but it's also the largest organ. So as you go through this, we're going to talk about just the components of the skin and the different layers, and then also get into the nails and hair, and then what makes up the inner portion where the sweat and the oil glands are located. And then we'll get into some of the stuff related to injuries and burns, and obviously some of the skin cancers that can occur. So in terms of the function of our skin, temperature obviously is really important. How it maintains our water balance is obviously because it's able to cool us off through sweating when we get very warm, and then we're also able to shunt blood towards the surface of the skin to where you're able to dissipate heat through evaporation. And then also when you get really cold, blood gets actually shunted towards the core of the body and away from the skin to maintain the core body temperature. So that's how our skin is able to maintain water balance and then also our temperature. And then in terms of vitamin D synthesis, it's very important also with exposure to the sun. And then obviously sensory receptors, which are really, really critical in terms of keeping us safe and then informing us about the outward environment that it is that we're around and touching. And then obviously the temperature that is we're sitting in. And then it's our first line of immune defense against anything that is on the outside. So if something penetrates the skin, it's because it was able to get in through an opening of some sort. And it was able to get in usually into the blood supply. And then that's how you end up being able to get sick, or you get an infection that's local. They can then in some cases actually spread and become systemic. When you look at the skin layers, there's two primary, the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, which is this one. And then you've got the dermis, which is going to be the thickest layer that also contains the sweat glands, the touch receptors, the erector pili muscle, which is what allows for the goosebumps to form and for your hair to stand on end, and then pressure receptors, and then obviously also some oil glands, and then our hair follicles. And then below the dermis is what's called the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. And this one is going to be mostly made up of fat, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these three as we go through the lecture. So the first layer, the epidermis, is the outermost protective layer, and it has sublayers attached to it. One of the important things to remember about this is that there are no blood vessels passing through it. So what that means is that the epidermis itself doesn't actually bleed. When you do bleed from your skin, it's because it's now penetrated through the epidermis and actually gotten down into the dermis or the hypodermis. So the epidermis is just a series of layers that help protect us from the outer environment. And it contains some very specific cells. So these things that are called keratinocytes, they produce the protein keratin, which is very important in terms of maintaining our epidermis healthy. Then we also have melanocytes, which is where melanin is produced, and these actually produce the pigmentation to protect our skin from ultraviolet rays, and also provides the color for our skin in terms of what our race might be related to our ethnicity. And then the dendritic cells, these are actually embedded within our skin in the epidermis, and they are macrophages, which means they are part of the immune system. So when you look at the layers of the epidermis, there's 5 on our palms and on the bottom of our feet, on our soles. And then the other parts of our body are only going to have 4 layers. So I'm going to go through each of these in detail. The stratum basale is this layer right here, which is at the very, very base of the epidermis. So what you're seeing here is this very kind of darker layer that I'm running through the cursor on. This is your stratum basale. And this is where all the skin cells for the epidermis originate. And how it works is that these cells here will go through mitosis, and as they multiply, they push the outer layers up, and eventually they will start basically flaking away and falling off. And here is also where you have the keratinocytes and the melanocytes. So the melanocytes, these are the ones that help provide the pigmentation, and they are also where this region is also where the stem cells for that epidermis are actually located. When you go to the stratum spinosum, which is the next layer up, this one here is one of the thicker layers that we have. And what are these? All these cells right here, these are primarily the keratinocytes that produce the keratin and also contain those dendritic cells that are going to help provide some of the immunity. So if something does try to get in, these macrophages, what they do, these dendritic cells, is they'll catch some of these microbes and then let the rest of the immune system know that, hey, we've caught this stuff. When we get to the actual immune system, we will be talking a little bit more about the dendritic cells and the role that they play in what we call antigen-presenting cells, where the antigen would be the microbe that actually got in. The next layer is right up here. It's called the stratum granulosum, and it's not very thick. And what it does is that it has little granules, and those little granules that you see in here are actually the granules of keratin. And what's going to happen here is that these granules are going to open up and start secreting and releasing the keratin into the layer. And the whole point of that is to provide some of that protection from the outer surface of the environment and from stuff getting into our actual skin. So the keratin is very, very important in that it provides some of that border and helping maintain the integrity of our skin, making it waterproof, and then also protecting it from the outside. The next layer that you see here, it's a very, very thin layer, and this is called the stratum lucidum. And this is that fifth layer, or the unique layer, that our palms and our soles of our feet have. And that is what adds a little bit of an extra protective layer to the palms and to the bottom of the feet, because they are always exposed to something, right? So we touch everything with our hands. When we walk barefoot, we're exposed to the surface that our feet are walking on, or if your feet are touching in any manner to the surface, or even what's in your shoes, that stratum lucidum is what's going to add that extra little layer of protection. And then the stratum corneum is the outermost layer, and this is the one where you now have no integrity in terms of the keratinocytes, and they have basically broken apart, and now they're just like flaky, dried up stuff, if you want to think of it that way. They're just dead keratinocytes. And what happens is that we actually shed this layer, and sometimes when you look up at a light and you see little flakes of what look like dust, most of the time what you're actually seeing is skin, and just little flakes of skin. So it's water resistant, but it is not waterproof. The waterproofing basically takes place down here where that stratum granulosum area is located. So the stratum corneum is the outermost layer of our skin in both thin skin and thick skin. Then in terms of the color of our epidermis, again, we talked about what the stratum basale does right here, which is where you have those melanocytes. And the melanocytes obviously secrete the melanin, which is going to give the pigmentation and the actual color to our skin. But our skin can actually also take on other tones. For example, when you blush, for individuals that have lighter skin, you'll actually see more of a redness that can happen, or splotches of redness. And that is because as we blush, part of what is happening is you're having a sympathetic type response where you actually get more blood going to the surface of the skin. And part of what occurs with the blushing is that it's part of the hemoglobin, the heme portion of the red blood cell, that actually will provide some of that redness. There is also the pigment called keratin, and keratin actually concentrates in the stratum corneum and then also in the lowermost layer, the hypodermis. And what happens from that is when you eat orange vegetables like sweet potato, carrots, squashes, you can actually take on more of an orangey color. And in individuals that have much lighter skin, you can actually see that much better than in individuals, obviously, that would have darker skin. Then cyanosis, this is just obviously the color that can be taken on when you have a deficiency of oxygen circulating in the blood. So for example, cold weather can do that. If a person is not perfusing blood properly, you will actually see blue on the lips, most obvious place. You'll see it on the nail beds as well. And then you would also, if you lifted up the gums inside the mouth, you will also see that there. So cyanosis is a very good clue when someone is deficient in oxygen. And you will see this a lot when we're talking about lack of oxygenation going to tissues, when we talk about the respiratory system, and then also what happens with the blood. And then erythema. This is that redness that occurs when you get embarrassed, obviously. It's partly what happens from sunburn as well, and then embarrassment. So erythema is just the color for redness. And then jaundice, all of you learned about this obviously when you were in EMT, and this is what occurs to the skin when you have some kind of problem going on in the liver. And what it is that bilirubin, which is one of the byproducts that occurs from the breakdown of the heme as our red blood cells are recycled. But in individuals that have hepatitis or a problem with the liver, for example, in cirrhosis, or people that have are very alcoholic or they're having liver failure, jaundice is going to be one of the signs that's going to indicate that there is issue going on with the actual liver. Then bronzing is a really important clue for individuals that have what's called Addison's disease. Sometimes it presents as a little bit of like a reddish rash, but then eventually it'll start bronzing more. And what this is an adrenal gland cortex failure. And so when we talk about the hormones, we're going to talk a lot about what the adrenal gland does. And one of the hormones that it actually secretes is cortisol. And what it's telling you is that this portion of the adrenal gland is actually not functioning. So people who have Addison's disease, or what we call adrenal cortex failure, are going to present with this bronzing color. Then pallor obviously is paleness from lack of blood flow, or when individuals are actually shunting blood more towards the core and it's not perfusing to the skin. Again, and you will see this much more so in individuals that have lighter skin. But again, pallor could actually present itself in the nail beds as well. And one of the things that you may see when this is occurring, it could also precipitate what happens with cyanosis. And then albinism, this can occur in individuals of all races, and this is a genetic lack of melanin. So what that means is that they may have melanocytes, but they're not producing the melanin, or they are very, very low in melanocytes and thereby will present with very, very, very light skin. These individuals that have this condition are actually very susceptible to getting sunburn, and it's very dangerous for them to be exposed to the ultraviolet light of the sun. And then hematoma, obviously, that is a bruise that usually begins more of a reddish purplish color, and then eventually will start breaking down, and it'll actually take on more of that greenish yellow color that occurs as your body's going through and processing the breakdown of the red blood cell. So that is what a hematoma is. Then the dermis is the next layer down below the dermis, or the epidermis, sorry, and it's composed primarily of connective tissue that is called collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, and then the cells that are primarily found throughout the dermis are called fibroblasts, and these are the ones that actually make the collagen fibers and the elastic fibers. The dermis also has blood vessels, sweat glands, what we call sebaceous glands, there's nerve endings there, the hair follicles originate there, and the nail roots as well, and then the pilorector or erector pili muscles that attach to the hair follicles. So when we look at the dermis, so this right here was the epidermis, and then just below that is all this blue stuff here on the stain of this microscopic slide. And we have two layers. This first layer of the dermis is called the papillary layer, and then the second layer of the dermis is called the reticular layer. And what you'll see in the actual papillary layer is that it's a little bit lighter in terms of the number of fibers that it has, but then these little round things that you see here, these are more the fibroblasts that you would see. And then these fibers that are running through, these are collagen fibers, and then the ones that are a little bit thinner, these are going to be elastic fibers. Within the reticular layer, here you'll see a lot thicker collagen, and then some, obviously, of the elastic fibers, but the collagen is going to be much deeper in that reticular layer. And then what you also have here, you'll notice that this area where the layer of the papillary layer of the dermis is thicker, this also means that the layer of the epidermis is going to be thinner. And what you have here is that you have many more nerve endings reaching right up until the point right below that stratum basale in the epidermis. And these are areas that are going to be much more sensitive on the skin. So you would see this primarily on, surfaces of the lips, around the nipple area, within the genitalia. This is where you would see more of these papillary regions that are reaching up underneath the thinner regions of the epidermis. So dermal papillae, that is what this is called, that upward boundary of the region where the papillary layer is right below the epidermis. And then what this is also going to provide are these things called epidermal ridges, which are going to help provide that region where you have your fingerprints in the palms of your hands and then also on the bottom of your feet. And then the reticular layer obviously is going to be the more thicker layer. And then the accessory skin structure is what you see here on the left. This is a diagram, and then this is an actual section, a longitudinal section of what you would see if we looked at the dermis under a slide. And so what you're looking at here, this right here is a hair follicle. This inside is going to be an actual hair. And then surrounding a hair follicle, you see these kind of white, looks kind of like oily globs, and these are sebaceous glands. And then you also will have, and you not seen very clearly here, but these are actually sweat glands that empty into this hair follicle. And we will look a little more closely at the sweat glands in a little bit. And then all of this, what you're seeing in terms of this pink stuff, these are the collagen and elastic fibers that run throughout the dermis. And then last of all, this is the pilorector muscle that is proximally located to a hair follicle that helps that stand on end or causes the goosebumps. So the sebaceous glands, when we look at them more closely again, these are actually going to be more oily looking. So if you were to take a class where you actually had to identify these, they're always proximally located to a hair follicle, because the sebaceous gland, the oil in the pores, actually empty into a hair follicle to help maintain the health of the hair. And then in terms of the sweat glands that we have these that are called merocrine glands. These are just regular sweat glands, so like what you would find here in this diagram. And what they do is that they secrete the sweat directly into a duct, and then the sweat gland has the surface that actually empties up into the actual surface of the epidermis. An apocrine gland, the important thing about this one are these right here, and you'll notice that they actually look more like little swimming pools. And what they are is that these actually become active during puberty and are part of what empty into a hair follicle, and then when it starts plugging up into the hair follicle along with the sebum, these are the things that actually end up causing the sweaty body odor that you will smell sometimes in kids that are going through puberty, or when you become anxious, and that smell that you can sometimes give off, that kind of a nervous sweat that occurs. And then in our ears, you will actually have glands that are called ceruminous glands that are producing the earwax, and those are going to be a mix of wax and also oil, and that's why the earwax has kind of like this oily feeling to it. Then in terms of our hair, remember that hair is made of keratin. The way it looks is just a little bit different because of the way that the DNA and the protein folds in terms of what creates a hair, and it's going to be very different, obviously, that what produces a nail, and then obviously what creates the keratin that just helps provide the waterproofing for our skin. And then the pilorector muscle here, again, is always proximally located to a hair follicle, and what it does is that it's a smooth muscle, it's involuntary, and it's under the control of our sympathetic system. So when your sympathetic system basically kicks on, something that happens in some cases is that it'll actually trigger those erector pili muscles to cause the pulling on it, and then you'll get the goosebumps and then kind of make your hair stand on end. Then our nails, I'm not going to say a whole lot about nails, but they're very thick, heavy keratin. And why they look different than hair, obviously, is because the way that the DNA directs on how the folding of this protein is, it's going to be a little bit thicker. And the nails actually originate from right here, the root of the nail bed are going to come from that region very closely tied to where that stratum basale would be in the epidermis, but they lack pigmentation. So nails on everybody are not going to be dark, and they grow in the root of the nail is actually going to be very much under the base here. And you will see that this region also has a very good blood supply because it's providing the blood that is going to then foster that stratum basale layer to then provide the growth for the nail. Then the hypodermis, this is located below the dermis and also known as the subcutaneous layer. So when you're learning how to give an injection that is going to go into the hypodermis, you're actually going into that fatty layer for the insulation. So it's a medication that will be distributed from that fatty layer, and obviously it's going to be different than an intramuscular injection that is going into the actual muscle. Then in terms of the types of injuries and the wounds that can happen to our skin, when our skin gets inflamed, part of what you're going to see in some cases is going to be inflammation, so there's going to be some swelling. And in other cases, in individuals that have much lighter skin, you will actually see, like for example, if a bug bites you, right, it's going to turn more red. Individuals of darker skin will have a little bit of discoloration to that, but there will also be that kind of little bump and swelling that will actually occur sometimes when you actually have a bite that occurs. When you actually break and penetrate the skin and go through the epithelium, then what will happen there is that obviously you could have bleeding. So in terms of the types of wounds that I want you to know, I want you to be familiar with these and also know the definition. An abrasion is more like a burn that occurs on the outer layer of the skin that can actually go down into some of the mucous membrane that occurs. And this is why sometimes you get that kind of reddish look, but not actual blood that'll pass through. And it'll also look like it's kind of seeping. And so what is seeping through in some cases is going to be some plasma fluid and some exudate that occurs. When it gets all goopy and kind of cloudy looking and gooey, that usually is a sign of infection, and that is more pus that is actually secreting more of the infection related stuff, and then some of the dead cells that it's trying to go through and heal. A laceration, big thing that you want to remember about this is that it's an unintentional wound. So most people don't intend to have a laceration, and what happens is that you're going to have usually jagged type edges. They're not going to be nice and even on both sides. And it's going to be also in some cases look like it was more of a tearing action. So these tend to be a little bit more serious. And obviously from looking at the way that this wound looks, this person is going to very likely going to need some surgery and some sutures to fix this. Penetrating wounds, these are obviously going to be injuries that actually pass through the skin. So obviously here, a bad day with a nail gun or other injuries that can occur that will pass through the skin. So it's usually made by a sharp instrument that passes through. Something as little as a splinter, that would be considered to be a penetrating wound, but obviously a small splinter of wood is not going to cause the type of damage that something much larger, like say an arrow that is made of wood, would cause a much greater penetrating wound. An incision, this again, the key word here is intentional wound that is made by a very sharp object, and the key thing too is going to be that you'll see that it has even margins, and usually it's a more of a straight looking cut. So like when you're doing a cut with a scalpel, for example, that would be considered to be an intentional wound. But that's a big difference in terms of the definition between incision and laceration. And then an avulsion, obviously, that means that something has been torn off. So in this case, obviously, this person is going to need surgery to get this repaired. Avulsions can also occur with ligaments and with tendons where they insert into bone. And in some cases, there's usually some bone that has actually come off. So there's going to have to be some cleanup that's going to end up taking place there. Amputations, as you know, this is when a body part has actually been torn off or cut off. And in these cases, obviously it's going to require surgery if you are able to locate the body part. And you always want to transport that with you, wrapped in some gauze and then placed on ice to help preserve the actual tissue. But amputations obviously are complete tearing of actual body parts, as small as it could be, like what you're seeing here with a finger. Then in terms of how the wound heals, obviously there's going to be the very first thing that's going to occur is called hemostasis, and that's going to be the way that your blood is going to start clotting to prevent more bleeding to occur. And then obviously there will be some scabbing, but there's going to be inflammation that will then occur for increased blood flow to the area with immune cells to help start healing and protect stuff from coming in and causing infections. As that's from that process of inflammation, then you're going to go into the process where the fibroblasts are going to start moving into the injury and starting to help it heal, and that's going to be the process of proliferation. And then you'll also have more collagenation that occurs from collagen fibers to start piecing that wound together and getting it to heal. And then little by little, then eventually you'll end up with some scarring that is going to take place, and that is when you have some what's called skin remodeling that will occur. And in some cases, for some individuals, they can form keloids, which are very thick scars that form on the actual skin. Then in terms of skin cancer, I do obviously want to make you guys aware of what these are and how to be able to identify them. Now, you're not going to be running on a skin cancer emergency, but obviously these are things that I want to touch on because they are injuries that can occur to the skin, and because of the job, you're obviously going to be exposed to more external environments more often because you're going to scenes where people are outside and, you know, you're going to be exposed. So I want you guys to make sure that you're able to pay attention to your moles. And basal cell carcinoma, I always remembered this one with the B that starts with basal as the bump, all right? So here's an example of two. They look kind of like little shiny bumps, and they're going to appear on places on the skin where they're more often exposed. So the forehead, the face, the back of the hands, the back of the neck, you know, areas that are always exposed to the skin. These tend to happen more often, obviously, in lightly complected individuals, but they can also occur in individuals with darker skin. So this is why it's always important to pay attention to what your moles are looking like or any bumps that you have on your skin. This basal cell carcinoma is the most treatable of all the skin cancers that we have, and it's something that you want to catch early. Squamous cell carcinoma, this one starts with an S, so you'll remember that it looks more like a scaly patch that just won't heal. And again, this one tends to appear more often in individuals that are more lightly complected. So what you're seeing here, this is obviously the back of the hand of some individual. This is an ear. And these are more squamous cells. And they look like scaly patches that look like they're going to start to heal, and then they don't heal. Again, these can also occur in individuals with darker skin. But this is also a very treatable skin cancer. But the difference with the squamous cell one is it can actually spread. And then the deadliest form of skin cancer is called a malignant melanoma. So the melanoma, obviously, you can see is more of a darker pigmentation from that word melanin. And these are melanocytes gone wild. And the big danger with these is that this is, for individuals who die of a skin cancer, this one's going to be the one that you die of. So these are skin cancers that are very, very dangerous. These melanomas, what they'll do is they'll actually start like these little tiny dots that you see here on this person, and then they can grow and then continue to grow and get bigger and bigger. And so you're going to have a mole that appears very, very small initially and then starts changing and growing. And if it continues to grow and you see it continuing to change, it's really important that you get this checked out, because it could easily turn into a melanoma. Or maybe you've had a mole for a long time on, your face or your back or somewhere, and then all of a sudden now it's not, and it's starting to change. And these are moles that it can actually appear in places that are not exposed to the sun. It's like, it could be between your butt cheeks, it could appear between your toes. So it's very important that if you do notice this, that you get it checked out, because of how easily these can spread, and they can eventually, spread into the lungs, into the liver, and eventually could also go into the brain. So you don't want to ignore these. So in terms of good mole, bad mole, what you want to do is you want to look at it in terms of its asymmetry, its border, color, and diameter. So it's what you call the ABCD of the moles. So if the mole is symmetrical all the way around, right, and it's even throughout in terms of the color, then you're looking at something that's probably normal. But if it's a melanoma, it's going to have some jagged borders, so it's going to be asymmetrical. So if we cut it in half, it's not going to be the even mole that you would see on like the left and on the right. Then you'll see that the border is obviously not nice and smooth. It's a little bit more jagged. Obviously, this one kind of looks like Europe. And then the color is not even throughout, so it changes in terms of its color. And then the diameter is going to be larger. So if it starts getting bigger than, what you would see about the size of a pencil eraser, then that usually shows that it could possibly be a melanoma. So these are your ABCDs instead of good mole, bad mole. Then with burns, the way burns are classified, and you will go through and you will learn a lot more about these when you get into soft tissue injuries in the EMS chapters of medic school. And this will be a bit, later in the months that you're going to be in school. But the degree of a burn is defined by whether it's superficial and then how deep it went into the actual skin layers. So obviously you can die from burns. Even a superficial burn could lead to death if the person gets severely dehydrated and they go into hypovolemic shock. And so how a burn occurs is obviously some type of thing that occurred on the skin that caused a temperature change that became very, very hot. So temperature is going to be a big indicator in terms of the severity of what happens with a burn. And the sun itself actually can cause, in some cases, third-degree burns. So temperature, the mechanism, obviously, of how the injury occurred. Sometimes somebody touched a surface or a chemical got spilled. And then how long that skin was in contact with the thing that caused the injury. Then is there blood flow to the skin, or is that compromised? And then in terms of the anatomical location and where the actual burn occurs. So obviously facial injuries, injuries that go all the way around a limb, or that are on the hands or on the palms or on the feet, or on the surface of the feet, those are going to be very, very serious and can become more serious depending on how much more of that gets exposed. And then treatment, obviously people that are going to be receiving treatment for burns are going to, in some cases, need IV fluid replacement, sometimes in some cases nutrition, depending on how severe it is. And then the more severe it is, the more debridement that will take place, and then obviously infection control. So when you're looking at burns, again, it has to do with how much of the skin got penetrated. So here you're looking at just a dermal burn, an epidermal burn. So you're looking at something that just occurred that went through the skin of the epidermis. Here you're looking at one that went a little deeper, so now we're going into the actual dermis. This would be considered second-degree burns. And then third-degree burns, or fourth-degree in some cases, this is what they call more full-thickness burns. And so they're not really classifying them more as like a first, second, or third degree, but now they're actually getting more into the surfaces and then how far in they went. So superficial type burns, these are going to be just epidermal burns, but as you can see, this individual got very, very burnt. Good day at the beach. This is what I like to call, obviously, the Norwegian person that has very, very light skin, goes to Florida, they spend their day at the beach, or they go to Disney World, and then this happens. And so what will happen here is the epidermis obviously has been burned. It's going to take a few days for it to get better. These can be very painful because it is an actual burn, and the person that suffers this can be also dehydrated. In some cases, they may end up having to go to the hospital because of the pain, or also because they're dehydrated. Burns that are going into what we call partial thickness burns, these are going to be the ones that go down into the actual dermis. So a moderate partial thickness burn is going to present as what you'll see here. It's going to be a little bit more wet, and in some cases it's also going to blister. So what you're seeing here along the edges and along here, this is what you're seeing where we have more blistering type burns. And all along these edges and within this actual tissue, it's very, very painful. So individuals that suffer these kinds of burns are probably going to need some pain management and also possibly some fluid replacement depending on how severe the rest of the body is looking. These are going to take longer to heal, and in some cases, depending on the severity, they may need some grafting and some scarring will occur. Then the deeper partial thickness burns are going to be the ones that went closer down into the hypodermis, and they're going to tend to look a little bit drier, so like what you see here, and there'll be more blanching with the skin as well. And these are going to be very painful as well because they're now still into that tissue that still has some nerve endings, and those nerve endings obviously are going to be triggering that pain. But then you'll notice that along the edge here, there's also a little bit of first-degree burn that is also very, very painful. These types of burns are probably going to be more likely to need some grafting and then also IV replacement for the individuals that suffer this and pain management. The more serious burns are always going to be the ones that are what we call full thickness, that have now gone into that depth of the actual hypodermis, and you'll see what looks more like a severe burn. And what you're looking at here is you actually have more bone tissue here. It's gone very, very deep. It's actually gotten through some of that muscle tissue, and then you see a lot of this darker burning tissue that's probably gone in and gone beyond those nerve endings. These individuals are going to need pain management, because just because they're full thickness burns, it doesn't mean, oh, you have no nerve endings now, you're not going to feel anything. But all along the edges of where these burns are, you're also going to have some second-degree burning that is occurring. So these individuals are going to need some serious pain management. So please do not withhold that from them. And they're obviously going to need IV fluids. This burn down here, you can see that this individual obviously suffered some very severe burns that actually went through and down into the depth of the bone and actually almost are losing some of the bone tissue here. And then you see a lot of severity with the second-degree burn, and then also all along the edge here where it was also exposed. So this looks like it was more like possibly a chemical burn that actually took place. And you'll learn more about these as you go through medic school, but very, very important to transport this person obviously to a burn center. Individuals that have these partial thickness burns as well, in some cases will need transport to a burn center as well. So that's the end of the integumentary and the membrane chapter. When you get to the actual tissues that we talk about with the heart, and then when we start talking more about the joints, and when we get to respiratory, we'll get a little bit more into the type of burns, or not, sorry, burns, the types of membranes that we have there, and get into a little more detail of how they function and what they do. So make sure that you take your quiz on this chapter, this series of chapters that we're going to be covering in this block, and let me know if you have any questions.